On November 18, 1978, more than 900 people died in the same jungle clearing within the same few hours, and most of them walked there themselves. How does one man convince nearly 1,000 people, including hundreds of children, that this was their only option? And why, right up until that day, did almost everyone who knew them believe they were living in paradise? This is the true story of Jonestown, the community built by a preacher named Jim Jones in the jungles of Guyana, and still one of the deadliest single days for American civilians in the entire 20th century. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how it happened, step by step, and you'll pick up 3 advanced English words you'll actually hear in real conversations, not just textbooks. To understand Jonestown, you first have to understand who Jim Jones was before any of this began. In the 1950s, he opened a small church in Indianapolis called the People's Temple. At a time when most American churches were still segregated by race, his congregation was intentionally, proudly integrated, and that alone made him unusual, even progressive for the era. Jones was charismatic in a way that people who knew him struggled to explain afterward. He preached about equality, about ending poverty, about building a community that actually lived out its ideals instead of just talking about them. People didn't just agree with him, they reorganized their entire lives around him. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, Jones moved his growing congregation first to Northern California, then to San Francisco, where his influence stopped being just religious and started becoming political. He was photographed with mayors and civil rights leaders. He was appointed to a position overseeing the city's public housing authority. To the outside world, he looked less like a fringe preacher and more like a rising figure in mainstream American politics. His connections went further than city politics. He met privately with vice presidential candidate Walter Mondale, was personally introduced to the sitting First Lady, Rosalind Carter, and in 1977 received a Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award for what looked, from the outside, like exactly the community his sermons had always promised. For someone who cared deeply about civil rights and wanted proof it could actually work, Jim Jones didn't look like a warning sign. He looked like a success story. But by the mid-1970s, journalists had started asking harder questions about missing money, about members who said they'd been abused, about a control over people's lives that went far beyond what any church should have. And Jim Jones did not respond to that scrutiny calmly. As the accusations mounted, Jones became convinced, or at least convinced his followers, that the government, the media, and unnamed enemies were closing in, determined to destroy everything he'd built. He grew increasingly paranoid, and he told his congregation there was only one place they'd truly be safe: a plot of jungle in Guyana, a small South American country where he promised they would build a socialist utopia, far from racism and persecution. By 1977, close to 1,000 of his followers had relocated with him. They called it Jonestown. Most of the people who moved there weren't naive or foolish. Many were working class and elderly Black Americans, drawn by a genuine promise of racial equality and a life free from the discrimination they'd faced for decades at home. By several survivors' own later accounts, for a while it actually did feel like the community it promised to be. Shared meals, shared work, children being educated together. That's part of what made everything that followed so effective. People had already given up their homes, their savings, and their old lives to be there. Once there, isolation became the point, not an accident. Outgoing letters were read before they were sent. Radio contact with the outside world ran through Jones and a handful of people he trusted completely. And periodically, in the middle of the night, Jones would gather the entire community for what he called a white night. A rehearsal, he told them, for the moment enemies would finally come to destroy them, when the only choice left would be to die on their own terms, rather than be taken. Some members later said they weren't always sure, in the moment, whether the poison in front of them during these drills was real. Back in the United States, worried relatives had spent months trying to get someone, anyone, to investigate what was happening inside Jonestown. In November 1978, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan finally flew to Guyana himself, along with journalists and a handful of concerned family members, to see the community firsthand. At first, the visit went smoothly. Jones staged a warm welcome, and that evening, the community put on a real show for their guests. Music, dancing, the life Jones had always promised on full display. By most accounts, it was a genuinely warm evening, which makes what happened barely 24 hours later even harder to reconcile. But quietly, over those 2 days, a small number of Jonestown residents slipped notes to Ryan's group, begging to leave with them when they departed. That request, the fact that anyone wanted out, was, to Jones, proof that his entire world was collapsing. As Ryan's delegation and the small group of defectors tried to board planes at the nearby Port Kaituma airstrip, Temple gunmen who had followed them opened fire. Congressman Ryan and 4 others were killed on that runway, and several more were wounded. The moment the shooting started at that airstrip back in Jonestown, Jim Jones already knew exactly what was coming next, and he had already decided what he was going to do about it. Jones called the entire community together in the settlement's main pavilion. On a tape recording made that afternoon, one that investigators would later recover and the public would eventually hear, he told them the outside world was coming, that soldiers would torture their children, and that what he was asking them to do wasn't suicide at all, but a final act of dignity on their own terms. A vat of a grape-flavored drink laced with cyanide had already been prepared. It's worth pausing on one small, strange detail here. For decades afterward, people would describe what happened as everyone drinking the Kool-Aid, and that phrase became a lasting English idiom for blind loyalty to a group or leader. But historians agree the actual drink mix used that day was a cheaper off-brand called Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid at all. Even the most famous detail of the story, repeated for nearly 50 years, turns out to be slightly wrong. Children were brought forward first. Armed guards stood at the edges of the pavilion, and many survivors and investigators later described people as having been coerced into participating, pressured or forced, not simply choosing this freely, whatever Jones called it on that tape. Within a few hours, 909 people were dead in Jonestown itself, more than 300 of them children. Counting the 5 people killed earlier at the airstrip, the total loss of life reached 918. It remains, to this day, one of the largest losses of American civilian life in a single, non-natural event in the country's history. Jim Jones himself was found dead of a gunshot wound to the head. Investigators were never entirely certain whether he took his own life or was shot by an aide who died beside him the same way. Either way, the man who had convinced hundreds of people the outside world was their greatest danger did not survive to explain himself. News of Jonestown shocked the entire world, and the story never really left the public imagination. It's the reason drinking the Kool-Aid entered everyday English as a way of describing blind loyalty to any group or leader, used constantly today by people who often have no idea where the phrase actually came from. A few dozen people in the settlement survived that day, mostly by fleeing into the surrounding jungle before the poison was ever brought out, or by simply being away from the main pavilion when it happened. Many of them spent the rest of their lives answering the same impossible question. How did you get out when so many people you loved didn't? Today, the site itself has largely been reclaimed by jungle. What remains is mostly memory, and a case study still taught in psychology courses and journalism schools on exactly how isolation, fear, and a charismatic leader can combine to make ordinary, decent people do something they never would have imagined. Let's lock in today's 3 words. Charismatic, having a powerful personal charm that draws people in. You could say, the new manager was so charismatic that the whole team trusted her within a week. Paranoid, having an extreme, often irrational fear or mistrust of others. After the break-in, he became paranoid about locking every door twice. And coerced, pressured or forced into doing something rather than choosing it freely. She felt coerced into signing the contract before she'd had time to read it properly. Try using one of these 3 in the comments. I'll be reading them. If you understood most of that without needing the subtitles, you're already listening at an advanced level. Subscribe. Next episode is even stranger than this one.